morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the merchant vessel, Northern Star, as it prepared to depart from Boston Harbor. Among the crew members bustling about, securing ropes and checking equipment, stood Sarah Mitchell, her dark hair tied back in a practical bun, her weathered hands gripping a clipboard filled with navigation charts. At 28, Sarah had spent more years at sea than most men twice her age, but today felt different. The sideways glances and whispered conversations among the crew told her everything she needed to know. Word had spread quickly that Captain Harrison had hired a woman as his new first officer, and the men weren't pleased about it. "This ain't right," muttered Tom Bradley, a grizzled sailor with 30 years of experience. He spat over the rail and shook his head. "A woman's got no business commanding a ship. Bad luck, that's what it is." His words carried across the deck, reaching the ears of several other crew members who nodded in agreement. They had all heard the stories, women on ships bringing storms, misfortune, and worse. The maritime world was a man's domain, and they intended to keep it that way. Sarah pretended not to hear their comments as she continued her inspection of the navigation equipment. She had faced this kind of resistance before, on smaller vessels and fishing boats. Each time, she had proven herself through skill and determination, but this was different. The Northern Star was a major commercial vessel, and her position as first officer put her directly in the line of fire. "Ma'am," called out Johnny Peterson, a young deckhand who had been watching her work, "the captain wants to see you in his quarters before we set sail." Sarah nodded and made her way toward the captain's cabin, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes following her every step. The crew's hostility was almost tangible, like a thick fog rolling in from the ocean. She had expected this reaction, but it still stung. Captain James Harrison was a man of few words, known throughout the shipping industry for his strict discipline and unwavering dedication to safety. When Sarah knocked on his door, his gruff voice called for her to enter. "Miss Mitchell," he said without looking up from his charts, "I trust you're ready for what lies ahead." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. "Though I should mention that the crew seems less than enthusiastic about my appointment." Captain Harrison finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "I didn't hire you to win a popularity contest. I hired you because this ship needs the best first officer available. And according to your references, that's you." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the captain, but she also sensed something else in his tone, a hint of uncertainty, as if he too was questioning his decision. The pressure from the shipping company, the crew's obvious displeasure, and the weight of tradition were all working against her. As she left the captain's quarters, Sarah could hear the crew's conversations growing louder and more heated. Some were threatening to quit before the ship even left port. Others spoke of refusing to take orders from a woman, claiming it went against everything they believed about life at sea. The situation reached a boiling point when Frank Morrison, the ship's cook and unofficial leader among the crew, approached her directly. His face was red with anger, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had been sailing these waters since before Sarah was born. "Listen here, lady," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "I don't know what kind of favors you did to get this position, but you don't belong here. This is a working ship, not some pleasure cruise for rich folks playing dress-up." Several crew members gathered around, nodding their agreement. Sarah felt her heart pounding, but she kept her voice steady and professional. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concerns, but I assure you that I'm fully qualified for this position. I've earned my maritime licenses and have extensive experience in navigation and ship operations." Frank laughed bitterly. "Paper don't mean nothing out here, sweetheart. When the storms hit and the waves are 20 feet high, your pretty certificates ain't gonna save this ship. You need real experience, real strength, and real leadership, things no woman can provide." The crowd of sailors murmured their approval, emboldened by Frank's words. Sarah realized that this was more than just skepticism about her abilities. It was a fundamental rejection of everything she represented. To them, her presence on the ship was not just unusual or uncomfortable. It was wrong on a level that challenged their entire worldview. As the confrontation continued, Sarah noticed that Captain Harrison had emerged from his cabin and was watching from a distance. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He was caught between supporting his decision to hire her and maintaining harmony among his crew. The tension on the deck was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other crew members had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, and Sarah could feel the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on her shoulders. This was her first real test, and how she handled it would determine not just her immediate future on the Northern Star, but possibly her entire career in the maritime industry. The ship's horn sounded, signaling their imminent departure, but the conflict between Sarah and the crew was far from resolved. As the Northern Star prepared to leave Boston Harbor, everyone aboard knew that this voyage would be unlike any other they had experienced. The question wasn't just whether they would reach their destination safely, but whether the ship could function with such deep divisions among its officers and crew. Sarah stood her ground, meeting Frank's hostile gaze with quiet determination, knowing that backing down now would mean the end of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. 3 days into their journey toward Liverpool, the crew's resistance to Sarah's authority had only intensified. Despite Captain Harrison's official support, the sailors found countless ways to undermine her orders and question her decisions. They would deliberately delay following her instructions, claim they couldn't hear her commands over the wind, or simply ignore her altogether. The situation came to a head during the morning watch when Sarah noticed irregularities in their course heading. She had been studying the navigation charts and cross-referencing them with the compass readings when she discovered they were drifting several degrees off their intended route. "Mr. Peterson," she called to the helmsman, "adjust our heading to 270 degrees. We're drifting too far north." Johnny Peterson, who had initially shown her some respect, now hesitated. He glanced around nervously at the other crew members who were watching the exchange with obvious anticipation. I think the heading's fine, ma'am," he stammered. "We've been following this course since yesterday." Sarah's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what was happening. The crew was testing her, seeing how far they could push before she would break or give up. But she also understood that this moment was crucial. If she couldn't maintain her authority over something as basic as navigation, she would lose all credibility as first officer. "Seaman Peterson," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the deck, "I am giving you a direct order to adjust our heading. We are off course, and if we continue on this trajectory, we'll add at least half a day to our journey." The young sailor's face flushed red. He was caught between following orders from his superior officer and maintaining solidarity with his fellow crew members. The tension was so thick that even the sound of the waves seemed muffled. Frank Morrison emerged from below deck, wiping his hands on his apron. He had obviously been listening to the exchange and decided it was time to intervene. "Peterson's right," he announced loudly. "That course has been good enough for 20 years of sailing these waters. Maybe the lady should stick to something she actually knows about instead of second-guessing experienced sailors." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crew. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. But she also recognized that this confrontation was inevitable. She couldn't command a ship if the crew refused to acknowledge her authority. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice cold and professional, "navigation is precisely what I know about. I have studied these shipping lanes extensively, and I am telling you that our current course will cost us time and fuel." Frank crossed his arms and sneered. "And I'm telling you that book learning don't mean squat out here. Real sailors learn by doing, not by reading pretty pictures in some fancy navigation school." The insult stung, but Sarah had learned long ago not to let personal attacks derail her focus. Instead, she pulled out her charts and spread them on a nearby crate, gesturing for the crew to gather around. "Look at these depth measurements," she said, pointing to specific markings on the chart. "Our current heading takes us over the Stellwagen Bank. The water's shallower there, which means stronger currents and more turbulence. By adjusting our course now, we avoid those conditions entirely." Several crew members leaned in to examine the charts, and Sarah could see some uncertainty creeping into their expressions. They might not like taking orders from a woman, but they weren't stupid sailors. They could read charts and understand navigation principles. Frank, however, wasn't ready to back down. "Charts can be wrong," he insisted. "Weather changes, currents shift. You can't navigate a real ship based on papers drawn by people who've never been to sea." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but she controlled it carefully. "Mr. Morrison, these charts are updated quarterly by the Coast Guard using the most recent surveys. And for your information, I've been to sea plenty of times. I've navigated vessels through storms that would have sent you running for the nearest port." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Frank's face turned red, and several crew members shifted uncomfortably. They sensed that the confrontation was escalating beyond simple disagreement about navigation. "You got a smart mouth?" "Lady," Frank said, stepping closer to Sarah. "But smart mouths don't command respect from real sailors. Out here, respect is earned through action, not talk." Sarah held her ground, meeting his aggressive stance with calm determination. "Then let's see whose navigation skills are better. If our current course proves to be the most efficient, I'll defer to your judgment on all future navigation decisions. But if adjusting our heading saves time and fuel as I predict it will, then I expect the crew to follow my orders without question." The challenge surprised everyone, including Captain Harrison, who had been watching the confrontation from the bridge. Frank looked around at his fellow crew members, suddenly realizing that he had been backed into a corner. If he refused the challenge, he would look weak. If he accepted and was wrong, he would lose face in front of the entire crew. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But when you're proven wrong, you pack your bags at the next port. This ship don't need officers who can't do their job." Sarah nodded crisply. "Agreed, and when I'm proven right, I expect a formal apology and your full cooperation for the remainder of this voyage." The crew watched in stunned silence as their unofficial leader shook hands with the woman they had been trying to undermine. The bet was struck, and now everyone aboard the Northern Star would have to wait and see whose judgment would prove correct. Captain Harrison finally stepped down from the bridge, his expression unreadable. He had allowed the confrontation to play out without intervention, but now it was clear that he would have to deal with the consequences of whatever happened next. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "So do I, Captain. So do I." By the 5th day of their voyage, it became clear that Sarah's navigation adjustments had been absolutely correct. The Northern Star had avoided the rough waters over Stellwagen Bank and was making excellent time toward Liverpool. The ship's log showed they were nearly 8 hours ahead of their original schedule, and fuel consumption was lower than projected. Frank Morrison found himself in an impossible position. The evidence was undeniable. The woman he had publicly challenged had been right about everything. The crew, who had initially supported him in undermining Sarah's authority, now watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. They expected him to honor his agreement, but his pride made it nearly impossible to admit he had been wrong. Sarah, for her part, didn't gloat or demand immediate acknowledgement of her victory. She continued performing her duties with the same professional competence she had shown from the beginning, checking navigation instruments, monitoring weather conditions, and ensuring the crew maintained proper safety protocols. The tension aboard the ship had shifted dramatically. Where once the crew had been united in their opposition to Sarah, now they were divided. Some began to grudgingly respect her expertise, while others remained stubbornly convinced that her success was just luck. Tommy Williams, a middle-aged sailor who had initially been one of Sarah's harshest critics, approached her during the evening watch. He removed his cap and spoke in a low, embarrassed voice. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I said some things I shouldn't have said, and, well, I was wrong about your abilities." Sarah turned from the compass she had been adjusting and studied Tommy's face. She could see genuine remorse there, mixed with curiosity and a grudging admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Williams, I appreciate that." "Mind if I ask you something?" Tommy continued. "Where did you learn to navigate like that? I mean, reading those charts like you did, knowing about the currents and all. That's not something you pick up from books alone." Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since boarding the Northern Star. "My father was a merchant captain. I spent my childhood summers aboard his ship, learning everything I could about seamanship and navigation. He taught me to read the ocean like a book, to understand how wind patterns affect currents, how underwater topography influences weather, how to predict storms by watching cloud formations." Tommy's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Your father was a captain. What was his name?" "Captain Robert Mitchell of the merchant vessel Atlantic Pride," Sarah replied. "He sailed the North Atlantic routes for over 20 years. The name hit Tommy like a physical blow. His mouth dropped open and he took a step backward. Several other crew members who had been listening to the conversation gathered closer, their faces reflecting the same shock that Tommy was experiencing. "Captain Robert Mitchell?" Tommy repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Captain Mitchell's daughter?" Sarah nodded. puzzled by the intensity of his reaction. "Yes, did you know him?" Tommy looked around at the other sailors, who were staring at Sarah with expressions of awe and disbelief. "Lady, your father saved my life. 7 years ago, during that terrible storm off the Grand Banks, my ship went down. Captain Mitchell and the Atlantic Pride pulled 12 of us out of the water when no one else would risk it." He was a legend among merchant sailors. The revelation spread through the crew like wildfire. Captain Robert Mitchell's reputation in maritime circles was extraordinary. He was known not just for his skill as a navigator and ship handler, but for his integrity, his care for his crew, and his willingness to risk everything to help fellow sailors in distress. "I sailed with your father twice," added Marcus Cooper, an older sailor who rarely spoke. "Best captain I ever served under. He could navigate by the stars alone, find his way through fog thick as soup, and handle a ship in weather that would terrify most men." As more stories about her father emerged, Sarah began to understand why the crew's attitude toward her was changing so dramatically. In the maritime world, family reputation carried enormous weight. The daughter of Captain Robert Mitchell wasn't just any woman trying to break into a man's profession. She was maritime royalty. Frank Morrison watched these developments with growing alarm. His position as the crew's informal leader was crumbling before his eyes. Not only had he been wrong about Sarah's navigation skills, but he had unknowingly challenged the daughter of one of the most respected captains in merchant marine history. The situation became even more complicated when Johnny Peterson, the young helmsman, approached Frank with obvious concern. "Frank, we got a problem. Word is getting around about who Miss Mitchell really is. The guys are starting to talk, saying maybe we was too hard on her. Maybe we should have listened from the beginning." Frank's jaw tightened. He had built his reputation among the crew by being their voice, their protector against unreasonable officers and unfair treatment. Now that foundation was cracking, and he could feel his influence slipping away. "So what if she's Mitchell's daughter?" he said defensively. "That don't automatically make her a good officer. Maybe she's just riding on her daddy's reputation." But even as he spoke the words, Frank knew how hollow they sounded. Sarah had proven her competence repeatedly over the past 5 days. Her navigation had been flawless, her orders clear and reasonable, her conduct professional under extreme pressure. The crew was beginning to realize that they had misjudged her badly. Captain Harrison, meanwhile, was experiencing his own moment of revelation. When he had hired Sarah Mitchell, he had focused entirely on her qualifications and references. The surname Mitchell hadn't meant anything special to him at the time, but now he understood exactly what he had gained in his new first officer. He called Sarah to his cabin that evening, his expression thoughtful and somewhat apologetic. "Miss Mitchell, I have to admit something. When I hired you, I didn't realize who your father was. I made my decision based solely on your credentials and performance records." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly how I wanted it, Captain. I've always tried to succeed on my own merits, not because of my father's reputation." Captain Harrison nodded slowly. "Well, you've certainly done that. Your handling of the crew situation, your navigation skills, your professionalism under pressure, it's all been exemplary. Your father would be proud." As night fell over the Northern Star, the ship sailed smoothly through calm seas toward Liverpool. The crew's hostility had given way to grudging respect, and some were beginning to show genuine admiration for their first officer. But Frank Morrison remained defiant, and Sarah knew that her biggest challenge still lay ahead. The weather turned violent on their 7th day at sea. What had started as a gentle morning breeze rapidly intensified into something far more dangerous. By midday, the Northern Star was battling 20-foot waves and winds strong enough to knock a man off his feet. Sarah stood on the bridge beside Captain Harrison, both of them watching the storm's development with growing concern. The barometer was dropping fast, and the cloud formation suggested they were heading into something much worse than a typical Atlantic squall. "How long until it passes?" Captain Harrison asked, his voice tense. Sarah consulted her weather charts and instruments. "This is a major system, Captain. We're looking at least 18 hours of severe conditions, possibly longer. The storm front extends for hundreds of miles." As if to emphasize her point, a massive wave crashed over the bow, sending spray across the entire length of the ship. The Northern Star shuddered under the impact, and both officers could hear equipment shifting in the cargo holds below. "All hands on deck," Captain Harrison shouted over the rising wind. Secure everything that isn't nailed down. The crew responded quickly, their earlier conflicts forgotten in the face of immediate danger. This was what they understood best: the raw, unforgiving power of the ocean and the need for every person aboard to work together for survival. Sarah took charge of coordinating the storm preparation efforts. She assigned teams to different areas of the ship, ensuring that cargo was properly secured, hatches were battened down, and emergency equipment was readily accessible. Her commands were clear and decisive, and for the first time since boarding, the crew followed her orders without hesitation. Frank Morrison found himself working alongside men who had begun openly praising Sarah's leadership. The contradiction was painful. His pride demanded that he maintain his opposition to her, but his experience as a sailor told him that she was handling the crisis exactly as it should be handled. "She knows what she's doing," admitted Carlos Rodriguez, a veteran sailor who had initially supported Frank's resistance. "Look how she's got us organized. Every man knows his job. Every piece of equipment is accounted for." Frank grunted noncommittally, but privately he had to acknowledge that Sarah's storm preparation was thorough and professional. She had positioned emergency crews at strategic locations, ensured that communication lines remained open between different parts of the ship, and coordinated with the engine room to optimize their power distribution. As the storm reached its full fury, the Northern Star was pushed to its limits. Waves crashed over the deck with tremendous force, and the wind howled through the rigging like a living thing. The ship rolled and pitched violently, making it difficult to maintain footing anywhere aboard. During the height of the storm, disaster struck in the engine room. A cooling pipe burst under pressure, sending scalding steam throughout the compartment. The engine crew evacuated immediately, but without proper cooling, the main engines would overheat and fail within minutes. Chief Engineer Pat Sullivan made his way to the bridge, his face grim with worry. "Captain, we've lost coolant pressure on the starboard engine. If we can't get that pipe repaired, we'll be dead in the water." The implications were terrifying. Without engine power in these conditions, the Northern Star would be at the mercy of the storm. They could be driven onto rocks, capsized by massive waves, or simply broken apart by the relentless pounding of wind and water. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Maybe 15 minutes before the engine seizes completely," Sullivan replied. "But nobody can work in that engine room with all that steam. It's like a furnace down there." Sarah studied the ship's technical manuals quickly, her mind racing through possible solutions. She understood the engine systems as well as anyone aboard. Another skill, inherited from years of learning at her father's side. What if we shut down the steam lines temporarily and use the emergency ventilation system to clear the compartment? She suggested. That would give us maybe 5 minutes of working time before the heat becomes unbearable. Sullivan looked skeptical. 5 minutes isn't enough time to repair that pipe properly. We'd need at least 20 minutes to do the job right. Then we don't do it right, Sarah replied. We do a temporary patch that will hold long enough to get us through the storm. Once we reach calmer waters, we can make permanent repairs. It was a dangerous plan. Working in the engine room under those conditions would be extremely hazardous, and a temporary repair might fail at any moment. But the alternative was almost certain disaster. Captain Harrison looked at Sarah with growing respect. Under enormous pressure, she was thinking clearly and proposing solutions rather than simply acknowledging problems. "Who's going down there?" he asked. "I am," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I know those engines, and I'm small enough to work in tight spaces quickly." Frank Morrison, who had been listening to the entire conversation, stepped forward. Despite his ongoing conflict with Sarah, he couldn't stand by while anyone, even her, risked their life for the ship. "I'm going with you," he announced. "You'll need someone to handle the heavy work while you focus on the technical repairs." Sarah looked at him in surprise. After days of hostility and resistance, Frank was volunteering to risk his life working alongside her. "Mr. Morrison, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "Whatever our differences, we're all on this ship together. If you're going down there, you're not going alone." Captain Harrison nodded grimly. "Make it happen. Both of you get down there and save this ship." As Sarah and Frank made their way toward the engine room, the storm continued to batter the Northern Star with unrelenting fury. The next few minutes would determine whether the ship and everyone aboard would survive to see another day. The crew watched tensely as their first officer and the Man who had been her greatest opponent disappeared into the steam-filled hell of the engine compartment, knowing that the lives of every person aboard now depended on two people who had been bitter enemies just hours before. The engine room was a nightmare of scalding steam and oppressive heat when Sarah and Frank descended into its depths. The emergency ventilation system had cleared some of the steam, but the temperature remained dangerously high. They had maybe 5 minutes before the heat would become unbearable and force them to evacuate. Sarah immediately located the burst cooling pipe, a main coolant line that had split along a welded seam under pressure. Steam was still hissing from the crack, making it impossible to get close enough for repairs. "We need to shut off the coolant flow to this section," she shouted over the noise of the engines and the storm. "There should be a valve assembly near the forward bulkhead." Frank nodded and fought his way through the maze of machinery toward the valve controls. Despite the heat and danger, he found himself impressed by Sarah's calm efficiency. She moved through the engine room like someone who had spent years in similar spaces, quickly identifying problems and solutions. "Found it," Frank called out. "Shutting off coolant flow now." The hissing of escaping steam gradually subsided as the pressure in the damaged line dropped. Sarah immediately moved closer to examine the crack, pulling emergency repair materials from a nearby toolkit. "It's worse than I thought," she said, running her hands along the split pipe. "The crack extends almost 6 inches along the welded joint. A simple patch won't hold under pressure." Frank wiped sweat from his eyes and looked at the damage. "So what do we do?" Sarah was already studying the pipe assembly, tracing the coolant lines with her eyes. "We bypass the damaged section entirely. See that junction point? We can connect a temporary line directly from the supply manifold to the output valve, cutting out the broken pipe completely." It was a brilliant solution, but it would require precision work under extremely difficult conditions. Frank watched as Sarah selected tools and materials with practiced efficiency. Her movements quick and sure despite the rolling of the ship in heavy seas. "Hand me that coupling wrench," she said, pointing to a specific tool. "And I'll need those rubber gaskets from the emergency repair kit." As they worked together, Frank began to understand just how extensively Sarah had been trained. Her knowledge of marine engineering was comprehensive and practical, not just theoretical. She understood how systems interconnected, where backup components were located, and how to improvise solutions using available materials. "Your father taught you this too?" Frank asked as he helped position a heavy pipe coupling. Sarah nodded, not taking her eyes off her work. "He always said that a good officer needs to understand every system on the ship. You can't command what you don't comprehend." The temporary bypass line took shape quickly under Sarah's direction. Frank found himself working harder and more efficiently than he had in years, motivated by the immediate danger and impressed by his partner's competence. "That should do it," Sarah said finally, tightening the last connection. "Turn the coolant flow back on slowly. If this holds, we should have full cooling capacity restored." Frank operated the valve controls carefully, watching pressure gauges as coolant began flowing through the new bypass line. For a few tense seconds, nothing happened. Then the temperature readings began dropping steadily and the engine's warning alarms finally fell silent. "It's working," Frank shouted, his voice filled with relief and admiration. "The temperatures are coming down fast." They made their way back to the bridge, both of them exhausted and soaked with sweat but triumphant. Captain Harrison met them at the top of the companionway, his face anxious with worry. "Report," he said simply. "Engines are running normally, sir," Sarah replied. "We've installed a temporary bypass around the damaged coolant line. It should hold until we can make permanent repairs in port." Captain Harrison's relief was obvious. "Outstanding work, both of you. How long until we're clear of the storm?" Sarah checked her weather instruments and charts. "Another 8 hours, sir. But the worst is behind us now. We should start seeing calmer conditions within the next 2 hours." As the immediate crisis passed, the crew began to gather around Sarah and Frank, eager to hear about their heroic repair mission. The story of how the first officer and the ship's cook had worked together to save the Northern Star spread quickly throughout the vessel. Frank found himself in an awkward position. After days of publicly opposing Sarah and questioning her competence, he had just experienced firsthand her exceptional skill and courage. The woman he had tried to undermine had risked her life to save the ship and everyone aboard. That evening, as the storm finally began to subside, Frank made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He approached Sarah on the bridge where she was updating the ship's log with details of the engine repair. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice uncharacteristically humble, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, studying Frank's face carefully. She could see genuine remorse there, along with something she hadn't expected, respect. "We were all just doing our jobs, Mr. Morrison." Frank shook his head. "No, it was more than that. You could have let someone else go down to that engine room. Hell, you could have let me go alone and probably been glad if I didn't come back up. But you risked your own life, and you made sure we both survived." The crew members within earshot listened intently to this exchange. Frank Morrison was not a man who admitted mistakes easily, and his public acknowledgement of Sarah's heroism carried enormous weight among the sailors. "I was wrong about you," Frank continued. "Wrong about your abilities. Wrong about your place on this ship. Wrong about pretty much everything. You've got more courage and skill than most men I've sailed with, and you've earned my respect." He extended his hand to Sarah, and she took it without hesitation. The handshake between the ship's first officer and the man who had been her greatest opponent marked a turning point that everyone present understood instinctively. From that moment forward, the Northern Star operated like a completely different vessel. The crew worked together with unprecedented efficiency and cooperation, united by their shared experience of surviving the storm and their growing respect for their first officer's exceptional abilities. The Northern Star arrived in Liverpool 2 days ahead of schedule, a testament to Sarah's expert navigation and the crew's newfound cooperation. As they approached the dock, Captain Harrison stood beside Sarah on the bridge, watching the bustling port come into view. "I have something to tell you," the captain said quietly. "When we were dealing with that storm, I finally decided to pull your complete service record from the Maritime Registry. I thought I should know everything about my first officer, especially given what we'd been through." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. Her complete record contained information she had hoped to keep private, at least until she had proven herself aboard the Northern Star. Captain Harrison continued, his voice filled with amazement. "Miss Mitchell, you didn't just learn navigation from your father. According to your record, you single-handedly brought a damaged fishing vessel through Hurricane Margaret 3 years ago when the captain was incapacitated. You've rescued crews from 2 different shipwrecks. You've been commended by the Coast Guard for exceptional seamanship on 4 separate occasions." He paused, looking at her with something approaching awe. "You're not just qualified to be a first officer. According to your record and certifications, you're qualified to captain any merchant vessel in the Atlantic Fleet. Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah smiled ruefully. "Because I knew that if I came aboard claiming to be some kind of maritime hero, the crew would have resented me even more than they did. I needed to prove myself through actions, not reputation." Captain Harrison shook his head in wonder. "Your father wasn't just a good captain. He raised an exceptional daughter. The maritime industry needs officers like you." As the Northern Star was secured to the dock, word of their remarkable voyage began to spread throughout Liverpool's maritime community. The story of the first female first officer who had saved her ship during a major storm captured the imagination of sailors, shipping executives, and port officials alike. Representatives from several major shipping companies approached Captain Harrison, eager to learn more about his remarkable first officer. They had heard about her navigation skills, her heroic engine room repair, and her ability to unite a previously hostile crew. "Is it true she's available for other assignments?" asked Charles Whitman, a senior executive from Atlantic Merchant Lines. "We have 3 ships that need experienced first officers, and frankly, we're having trouble finding qualified candidates." Captain Harrison looked across the dock to where Sarah was supervising the unloading of cargo, working alongside crew members who now treated her with obvious respect and admiration. "You'd have to ask her yourself," he replied. "But I can tell you this. Any shipping company that's smart enough to hire Sarah Mitchell will have made the best decision they could possibly make." Frank Morrison, meanwhile, had become Sarah's most vocal supporter among the crew. When other sailors from different ships questioned whether a woman could really handle the responsibilities of ship's officer, Frank would regale them with detailed accounts of Sarah's competence and courage. "I've sailed with a lot of officers over the years," he told a group of skeptical dock workers. "Good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. But Sarah Mitchell is something special. She's got the knowledge, the courage, and the leadership skills that you dream about finding in an officer." Any crew would be lucky to sail under her command. The transformation in Frank's attitude had a ripple effect throughout Liverpool's sailing community. If Frank Morrison, known throughout the port for his traditional views and stubborn nature, could be won over by a female officer, then perhaps other sailors needed to reconsider their own prejudices. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her boarding house. Captain Harrison appeared at her door with a formal-looking document in his hand and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Mitchell, I have a proposition for you," he announced. "The Maritime Board has reviewed your service record and the reports from our voyage. They're offering you command of your own vessel." Sarah's heart stopped. "Command? You mean my own ship?" Captain Harrison nodded enthusiastically. "The merchant vessel, Liberty Belle, a brand new ship larger than the Northern Star with the most advanced navigation equipment available. The Maritime Board specifically requested you for the position after hearing about your performance during the storm." Sarah took the document with trembling hands. A ship of her own. It was everything she had dreamed of since childhood, but had never dared to hope for in a world that seemed determined to keep women out of positions of real authority. "There's something else," Captain Harrison continued. "The Maritime Board is launching a new training program for female officers. They want you to help develop the curriculum and mentor other women who want to pursue careers at sea. You'd be making history, Sarah, opening doors that have been closed for centuries." As Sarah read through the official appointment documents, she thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her about perseverance, competence, and integrity. She thought about the crew of the Northern Star, who had learned to judge her by her actions rather than her gender. Most of all, she thought about all the young women who might one day follow in her footsteps. "When do I take command?" she asked. Captain Harrison smiled. "The Liberty Belle is being commissioned next month. You'll have a crew of 35 sailors, most of whom have specifically requested to serve under your command after hearing about the Northern Star voyage." The news spread quickly through Liverpool's maritime community. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had been dismissed and undermined by her own crew just weeks earlier, was about to become one of the first female captains in modern merchant marine history. Frank Morrison was among the first to congratulate her. "Captain Mitchell," he said, using her new title with obvious pride, "I hope you'll consider me if you ever need an experienced cook on your new ship." Sarah looked at the man who had been her greatest opponent and was now one of her strongest supporters. "Mr. Morrison, I'd be honored to have you aboard the Liberty Belle." As the sun set over Liverpool Harbor, Sarah stood on the dock looking out at the ships preparing for their next voyages. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be other crews to win over, other storms to weather, other challenges to overcome. But she had proven to herself and to the maritime world that competence, courage, and determination could overcome even the deepest prejudices. The girl who had learned navigation at her father's side had become a woman who would chart new courses for generations of sailors to follow. The crew that had once claimed she didn't belong on their ship had been silenced not by argument or authority, but by the undeniable evidence of her exceptional abilities. Captain Sarah Mitchell's story was just beginning, but already it had changed the maritime world forever. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier were crumbling. One voyage at a time, one storm at a time, one converted crew member at a time. The Northern Star's voyage had ended, but the legend of the woman who had commanded it was destined to inspire sailors for generations to come.